All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Cherry Kubota, connecting from the Ohio State University. I'm a professor in horticulture crop science department, and then also the director of Ohio Controlled Environment Agriculture Center. So if you are new to this community, welcome. This is Indoor Ag Science Cafe, organized by many groups. Most of them are USDA, NIFA funded project groups, ADVANCEA, OptimIA, CEA HERB, and then also since last month, we have UGGA, United Greenhouse Growers Association, co-hosting this event. So what we do is basically sharing science-based information and whatever useful information to advance controlled environment agriculture. That includes all kinds of systems. So not just high-end vertical farm, but also greenhouse and high tunnels, and then all kinds of crops, food crops, ornamental crops, medicinal crops, um, any crops. So that's what we do. And then speakers, we get your recommendations, and then also we select based on the needs. Could be academic speakers, could be industry speakers. Academic speakers can be a group of scientists and graduate students to showcase what they are doing regarding research findings, or project team sort of summary update. That's also nice. Industry speakers, introducing what you do in R&D, what's in pipeline, what's something exciting, and then also sharing experience, lessons learned from your operations. That'd be great. So it's kind of providing opportunities for us to think about research, problem-solving research, something you are struggling with, or something you found, potentially interesting to be considered in a CEA. So yeah, so if you wanted to contribute, let us know. I am happy to communicate with you. So previous cafe, I think we started 2018, but anyway, all the archives available in OptimIA website, and then also YouTube channel, and then Advanced CEA website, CEAR website, so that you can find previous ones. So I encourage you to check it out. So today we're going to have Dr. Chris Carey from Iowa State University talking about controlling herb growth in CEA. And then I'd like to give you two upcoming cafe events or webinars. The first one, May 28th. This is an unusual or special date and time. We usually do Tuesday 11 a.m. Eastern, so that's what we have been doing years. This special one, because it's going to be led by UGGA, United Greenhouse Growers Association, and then they're going to use this as an opportunity to have an open discussion, um, forum, what they can do to respond to the needs of greenhouse growers. So the Sam Coronat and John Arrow, Melanie Yelton are going to be the discussion leaders of this forum. And then June, we're going to back to the original schedule, Tuesdays, 11 a.m. And then the topical presenter is Dr. Mark Hoffman, North Carolina State University. He is finishing this project, 5-year project, advancing next generation strawberry propagation strategies. And then gonna talk about their achievements of this multi-state effort, again, funded by NIFA, USDA NIFA. So with that, so nice to have Chris back to speak in this Indoor Ag Science Cafe. And actually, one of my favorite speakers, Chris.
Now, now,
So
now you're just pandering.
Yes. All right. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and then it's all
I
yours,
will
Chris.
share. Okay. Well, I apologize that picture that Cherry showed. I've had undergraduates tell me that it's time for me to get new photos because they said it's false advertisement because my beard in that one is pretty much brown and red, but as you might be able to see out there in digital world, it's a little bit grayer now. So I guess that must mean I'm a little bit smarter, perhaps. I'm not sure. Today, I'm excited to share with you a sort of a tale that I've been working on for a long time. The first presentation that I had here was talking about controlled environment production of culinary herbs, particularly fresh cut culinary herbs. And a lot of my research is focused on looking at lighting, temperature, nutrition, all the different factors involved in producing fresh cut culinary herbs. But I also had another foot sitting in containerized herb production because in the greenhouse, we also have lots and lots of growers of containerized culinary herbs, not just in the food production space, but also in the more traditional containerized floriculture space. Because right now, our greenhouses are filled with spring bedding plants, including containerized herbs, as well as throughout the year. You're going to see those containerized herbs usually in the produce section of your greenhouse. So this is going to be a talk focused on controlling growth and size for containerized herbs. Now, contrary to popular belief, bigger is not always better. The grower shall remain anonymous, but you can look at these basil plants and you can see that they are a little bit too big for their container. So, what we're often trying to do with containerized crop production, whether it's containerized herbs, whether it's floriculture crops or foliage plants, is we're usually trying to control plant size because plants in a container usually get bigger than we may want them to during production. So, why are we controlling plant size? Well, a lot of it has to do with creating an aesthetically appealing product. You want to balance that plant in the container with the container size. A really good rule that we'll use is we will talk about the 60-40 rule. If you look at a plant from the bottom of the height or the bottom of the pot to the top of the plant, about 60% of that height should be plant, and about 40% of that should be the pot. So you've got that nice balance. Another way of looking at that is the plant should be around 1.5 times the height of the container. So if you've got a 4-inch tall pot, you'd be looking for a plant that is 1.5 times that height, 6 inches. Conveniently, you also see that 1.5 times that pot size leads us back to that 60-40 rule. 60% plant, 40% container. So that's where we're starting, is we're trying to make something that looks aesthetically pleasing. But there are things outside of just the appearance of plants that we can benefit when we control growth. For example, we can increase our space use efficiency by controlling plant size and stopping them from growing excessively. We can increase space use efficiency by increasing plant densities, both in our production facilities where we have more compact plants that can be grown at a higher density and get more units per growing area inside of our greenhouse, which is always going to be beneficial to increase our output. The other way that we can increase plant densities that's useful is going to be when we're shipping. We have a fairly wholesale heavy industry with lots of movement of plant materials. They're going on racks and then the racks in the truck. And again, when you have more compact plant material, you can have higher plant densities on your racks and in those trucks for shipping, which again increases the efficiency of your shipping costs. And then finally, we also get some resource use efficiency when we're controlling plant growth. When you produce a plant with less excessive growth, that smaller plant will reduce water use. When you have smaller leaves, you're going to have less stomata, less transpirational area, and less water loss. The other thing that you're going to have is less nutrient use with those smaller plants. If we're targeting basil to have, say, 4% nitrogen in the leaf tissue, a smaller plant will require less fertilizer to achieve 4% nitrogen to have a healthy green leaf than a larger plant might. So there are going to be a number of different benefits why controlling plant size is beneficial for producers as well as consumers. So how can you control plant growth? Well, plant growth retardants are going to be probably the most widely used tool in greenhouse crop production for controlling growth. Here I've just got some examples from the ornamental world where we have some seed propagated New Guinea impatiens sprayed with a range of paclobutrazol concentrations from 0 to 40 parts per million. You can see that using paclobutrazol and increasing the concentration will control the size of these plants and can be used to produce a more compact plant. But this isn't the only method that we have for controlling plant growth. We have a whole host of other things we can use. In addition to plant growth retardants, we have crop scheduling, brushing, cultivar selection, using DIF, the difference between the day and night temperature, restricting irrigation, restricting fertilizer concentrations, and specifically reducing phosphorus concentrations. Now, when we look at this variety of means for controlling plant growth, I like to classify them as chemical and non-chemical, with chemical growth control explicitly referring to the use of plant growth retardants, and non-chemical growth control explicitly referring to non-growth retarding chemical means of controlling growth. Now, some of you out there might be looking at this and say, well, fertilizer and phosphorus, those are chemicals. I wouldn't argue with that, but just for the sake of using common vernacular, chemical growth control is going to refer to plant growth retardants. Now, what's the big deal with herbs? There is currently no plant growth regulator compound that is labeled for use on culinary herb production in containers. A little bit later in the presentation, you'll see that it's not because they don't work, but we just don't have a label on any commercial growth retardant. Now, we do have a label with uniconazole products such as Sumagic or Concise for use on seedlings of solanaceous plants like tomato, pepper, and eggplant, where you can apply up to 10 parts per million before the 4th true leaf stage. That's the only edible crop that we can apply a PGR on. So there's really no PGRs for these food crops. What does that mean? That means that for containerized herb growth, we have to rely on this non-chemical approach to controlling herb plant size when they're grown in containers. So today, what I'm going to focus on are 6 primary approaches where we can control plant growth. The only one of the non-chemical methods that I'm not going to discuss is crop scheduling. The rest of them, I'm going to use examples from research with containerized herbs to discuss these non-chemical methods. So here we have, again, this is from the ornamental world. You might look at this and you might think, oh, we've got an untreated plant on the left and we've got a treated plant on the right, one that's been sprayed with a plant growth retardant. That's not the case. What you actually see here are 2 different cultivars of the same species. Both of these are Angelonia angustifolia with white flowers. The plant on the right is from the Serena series. The plant on the left is from the Serena series, and the plant on the right is from the Serenita series. And that name, Serenita, implies diminutive, and it's referring to the compact growing nature of the Serenita series compared to that of the Serena series. So this is an example of how an ornamental producer is using cultivar selection to get more compact plant growth. We can do this same thing with culinary herbs. Now, a number of years ago, I came and I presented data on different hydroponically grown basil cultivars in different hydroponic systems. What I wanted to do is bring back some of that research. Now, this research did not happen in containers. Everything else we will see did happen in containers, but the lesson still holds. So in this study, we had 35 different cultivars of basil in our study, and we had basil from a number of different classes, including sweet basil, purple, large leaf, cinnamon, Thai, bush, lemon, and holy basil. And we took data on a variety of the characteristics of plant growth at the end of the production. So when we're looking at differences, there are differences across fresh mass, height, leaf index, a proxy for leaf size, and branching. But what I want to do is focus on the differences in plant height. If we were talking about fresh cut culinary herbs, I would probably focus on fresh mass, because fresh mass is what we're selling with fresh cut herbs. But with containerized herbs, we're just selling one container. That's the unit. So we're going to look at plant height. Across all these different green basil cultivars, we have a range of plant sizes. You can see, and I picked out the extremes for this example, that for a green leaf sweet basil cultivar, we had heights ranging from 9.5 centimeters for Genovese Compact up to 26.1 centimeters for San Remo after just 3 weeks in production. Now, again, this was in a hydroponic system, but these differences would still come through in a containerized system. We see a nearly threefold difference in plant height across just the 12 or so green sweet basil cultivars that we included in our study. So, what does this mean? When available, compact cultivars are always going to be the first step in controlling finished plant size. I would not be suggesting this for fresh cut culinary herb producers because we're trying to maximize biomass. But again, for containerized plants, we're trying to grow an appealing containerized unit. Now, one challenge with using cultivar selection in reality is going to be the breadth of cultivars that we can select from. So let's take, just for example, look at 2 different herb species. I mentioned we use 35 different 35 different basil cultivars in our study, and there's even more than that. There's a lot of different basil cultivars to select from. Let's pick a different herb, say flatleaf parsley. Probably only about 3-4 different cultivars that we can select from. And if you want to look at something like thyme or tarragon, you're going to have even fewer and fewer varieties. So basil is clearly going to have the majority of selection for cultivars. There is also a wider variety in dill. Most notably, fernleaf is the most compact growing variety that we have for containerized production. But even within basil, we have challenges. For sweet basil, that green basil that we all eat and have used, that's got a wide variety of cultivars. But if we were looking at, say, holy basil, there's really only going to be one. So the use of cultivar selection can be limited. Most of the herbs, cultivars that we're selecting for in production are coming from field production or the development of field cultivars. This is slowly changing as we're starting to see the more compact varieties of, say, basil or that fernleaf dill. But I suspect that with the continued popularity of edible food crops as well as containerized crops, we will see more breeding dedicated for compact varieties that might be more well suited for containerized production. Okay, let's look at diff. The air temperature is another influencing factor on stem elongation. And what I'm referring to is the difference between the day temperature and the night temperature. Mathematically, you can see this on the screen as day temp minus night temp. That's going to give you your diff. Now, what happens is stem elongation is promoted as the diff increases. So as the day temp and night temperature have a greater difference, you see greater cellular elongation and more stem elongation. Alternatively, as the diff decreases and becomes less positive, becomes zero, and becomes negative or increasingly negative, stem elongation will be inhibited. It's not making the plant shorter, it's just reducing the amount of elongation that's occurring. Now, diff is a widely used and well-studied technique for controlling the size of containerized ornamental plants. It was popularized in the late 80s by Royal Hines and John Irwin from Michigan State University, and it continued to be evaluated for use in floriculture crop production. But when it comes to culinary herbs, it hasn't been as widely used. So a former graduate student and I put together a study looking at containerized basil grown under 2 average daily temperature regimes. One, we had a summer regime where the average daily temperature was 25 degrees Celsius and the crop time was 4 weeks. In a different temperature regime, we had an average daily temperature of 20 degrees Celsius for an average daily temperature and a 5-week production period. Within each of these average daily temperature regimes, the 25 and the 20 degrees Celsius ADT, we had a range of diffs ranging from -10 up to +15. Now, for both the summer and the winter average daily temperatures of 25 and 20 degrees Celsius respectively, the day-night periods were all 12 hours long. Traditionally, we might see something more like a 16-hour day and an 8-hour night, but for scientific purposes and trying to keep the average daily temperature not confounding, we went with a 12-hour day and a 12-hour night. Well, what did we see? This is what we've got. On the top row, you see the basil grown with that average daily temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. And on that bottom row, you see the basil grown at that average daily temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. Across those, again, we have negative 10 degrees diff on the left side, increasing up to positive 15 on the right side. And you'll notice under the summer regime, we saw plant height increase up to 5 degrees positive diff. But as we started to get to that 10 degree positive diff or 15 degree positive diff, we started to see an inhibition of elongation. We see a somewhat similar response, but it's much more muted underneath those winter conditions at 20 degrees Celsius. If we take a look at this graph, we've got a bit more evaluation of this data. Again, with that summer, we saw an increase in height at a much stronger slope underneath those summer conditions. But as we got to 10 and 15 degrees positive diff, we had a much greater inhibition than we saw during those winter temperature regimes. Well, what is explaining what we're seeing here? Here we see some previous work done by a graduate student and myself, Kelly Walters, now at the University of Tennessee. And we see that sweet basil is a cold-sensitive species, or said otherwise, it is a warm-growing species. Now, when we look at that winter diff range, we can see that positive 15 and 0 and 10 was ranging across these air temperatures. Whereas in that summer range, once we started getting in those very positive diffs, we had temperatures that were supra-optimal, which may have been contributing to some of that inhibition on the high side of the diff. So the use of diff is going to range in effectiveness across these different temperature regimes. Now, this focused on basil, as much of the culinary herb work that we've done has focused on, because that is the most popular species. However, it would be very valuable to perform other research on diff on other species, non-basil species, to look at the effectiveness using diff for height control. In particular, more opportunities with cold temperate or cold tolerant crops, those crops with a lower base temperature. Basil's base temperature is much higher, and that's considered a cold sensitive species. But is that sensitivity of basil going to inhibit the use of diff? Well, I'm not sure. Most containerized herb growers are going to be growing basil, and a lot of it in the same greenhouse as those cold tolerant or cold temperate species. So I'm not sure how we're going to be able to use those cool night temperatures when we're growing basil. I like to call drought the original growth regulator, and restricting irrigation suppresses growth. Here we see another example from the ornamental world, and this was some work that I did with previous students, looking at containerized nemesia grown across a range of substrate volumetric water contents, ranging from 0.15 to 45. You can also look at that as 15% moisture up to 45% moisture. Now, just to give you some context, that 30% moisture in the middle, that's sort of the Goldilocks as far as a standard greenhouse substrate moisture. That 45%, that's going to be grown real wet. It looks like the containers that my students grow when they water them on a Friday night as they're leaving the greenhouse for the weekend. Alternatively, that 15% substrate volumetric water content, that's going to be a fairly to very dry substrate, and that's what the containers look like when the undergrads remember they've got plants when they come back at school on Monday. But you can see here that restricting irrigation is an effective means of controlling growth. And this is all based on the excellent work of Mark Van Ursel. We use his sensor system to develop these techniques with his blessing. So I just wanted to give Mark credit where credit is due. We wanted to take this same approach and look at restricting irrigation that has been used on floriculture crops and use it on containerized herbs. So we planted basil, dill, parsley, and sage seedlings, watered them or irrigated them to container capacity at transplant, and then let them dry out to a range of volumetric water contents, again, from 15 to 30%. This was maintained at these target set points using the precision irrigation system with a data logger controlled solenoid that would open and give micro irrigations once you had a substrate volumetric water content dropping below that threshold. Now, I wanted to show you the substrate water contents for the different set points for the 4 different species. And you can see here that for sage, dill, parsley, and basil, our set points held fairly accurately throughout the entire experiment. You can see there were instances with sage and parsley where they bumped up a little bit with some of the different treatments, but you can also see that we had relatively consistent water contents across the treatments for the duration of the experiment. When we get to the end of the experiment, you can see that species varied in their response to substrate moisture. On the bottom of this page, or on the bottom of this slide, you can see flatleaf parsley, and you can see that with less water, we had more compact growth. In particular, look at the length of the petioles on the foliage. There was no different in fertility. All containers had the same amount of controlled release fertilizer incorporated into each pot. Yes, I made my students measure it out for every pot to make sure it was correct. Additionally, the controlled release fertilizer we used didn't have a release that was influenced by the water content. So you didn't have a difference in fertilizer availability across these treatments. Now compare the response of common sage to flatleaf parsley. And you'll see that as sage, the substrate volumetric increased, we did start to get a little bit more compact growth. And that would make sense. Sage is a drought tolerant plant and can be sensitive to some of those excessive moisture contents. Now we see a similar trend here. We saw good growth control with dill, but with Italian large-leaf parsley, we didn't see as much. And that's because that the basil tends to be a more drought tolerant species. And so we didn't get the suppression or the reduction that we might expect. Looking at the data, we saw, again, up to a 40% difference with substrate moisture across those volumetric water contents. Now, I'm talking about height a lot, but you saw with any of these plants, and when I referred to planting density earlier in the talk, we're also looking at the width of the plant too. And the same thing happened with width that we saw with height. Under those drier conditions, we had narrower parsley plants, again, allowing you to grow your plants on a more compact center. We did see the same trend in leaf area as well, where we had smaller sized leaves under that more restricted irrigation. But as you might have seen from the photograph, the leaves didn't get to a point where they were too small that they were not marketable. In fact, I think most people looking at the size of the leaflets wouldn't be able to tell much of a difference. Like I mentioned, basal height was affected by volumetric water content, but to a much lesser degree. Many of the herb species that we grow are what we would call cereal or ruderal species, and they grow in nutrient-poor environments and poor soils, and they can be tolerant to less than ideal conditions, of which sweet basil is one of them. Now, this restriction that we saw was not caused by diminished photosynthesis for parsley. We had no statistical effect on volumetric water content on photosynthesis for parsley, even though we saw enhanced growth restriction under those drier conditions. But we did see a suppression in photosynthesis for basil at those lower volumetric contents. But what's interesting is we did not see a subsequent or a corresponding suppression of growth. Photosynthesis was impacted much more than the mass or the stem elongation. Now, there are some other benefits as well. You'll see here, this is the cumulative irrigation that was used across the volumetric water contents for growing parsley. And what you see here is you see almost a 4-fold or somewhere around a 3.5-fold reduction in water use at that lowest volumetric water content compared to the highest volumetric water content. So although living in a state like Iowa, water availability is not a problem for us, or at least not yet. This is something to consider if you are in a more water restricted area, is that you can save quite a bit of water inputs by growing drier and producing smaller plants. Again, going to that resource use efficiency. And the same thing with basil. Even though we might not have gotten growth control with our basil at those lower substrate volumetric water contents, we still had savings in water. And there are some other benefits too to growing dry, like restricting pathogens or the development of root rots. So when it comes to growing herbs, restricting irrigation is a great technique to use, except the magnitude of growth control you're going to get is going to vary across the different species that you may be producing. I say the best growers are dry growers. It can be extremely challenging to try and implement this with hand irrigation. This sensor-based irrigation, especially when you're growing on the much drier end, is going to be the best approach to controlling your substrate water content, because you can go from very dry to dead much more quickly than at those higher water contents. But again, I'd like to underscore that regardless of the growth control, growing at those drier substrate volumetric water contents allows us to reduce our water use and save those resources and inputs for our crops. And so I think that's always something that we should consider is, can we produce as good a crop or better while reducing the inputs that we're putting into that crop? Now, I mentioned fertilizer and phosphorus as some of the means for controlling our containerized herb growth. And again, this comes no surprise to greenhouse growers, where we often will use the fertilizer concentration. And in this picture on the top row, I've got water-soluble fertilizer ranging from 0 to 400 parts per million. And on the bottom row, controlled release fertilizer ranging from 0 to 10 pounds per cubic yard. We can often use the fertilizer, much like we use water, as the gas and the brake. So we can apply additional fertilizer or increase the fertilizer concentration to enhance growth, or we can withhold or restrict fertilizer in order to suppress excessive growth. So again, we have done, we did this study with a number of different ornamental plants, but I wanted to look at containerized culinary herbs. So we had 12 different culinary herbs grown in 11 centimeter containers, and they were fertilized with either water-soluble fertilizer or controlled release fertilizer. And just to give you an example, I didn't have a species that started with A nor one with Z. So we went from basil to watercress when we were selecting the different species. And in addition to the growth data that we collected, like height, widths, fresh mass, dry mass, we also measured the tissue concentration of the plants at the end of the experiment. Because we want to have an appropriately sized plant, but we need to have an appropriately sized plant that appears healthy and marketable to consumers. We can't sell plants that are displaying symptoms of a nutrient deficiency as a result of restricting irrigation. So here we take a look at Italian flatleaf parsley, and you can see that as the fertilizer concentration increases from 0 to 400 parts per million for water-soluble fertilizer, or increases from 0 to 10 pounds per cubic yard for controlled release fertilizer, we see a similar tail that we have seen with ornamental plants. Growth is enhanced with additional fertilizer. Now, what I would like to pay attention to particularly is, you'll recall in talking about the irrigation and the effect of moisture on crops, I mentioned that many herbs are cereal or ruderal species, and they're adapted to growing in maybe less than ideal conditions. Look at the difference in growth between 0 and 50 parts per million, or 0 and 1 pound per cubic yard of CRF. That shows you the impact that just minimal fertilizer will have to meet the needs of crops to produce sufficient growth that is free of nutrient deficiencies. Now, if you look at the promotive effects of growth as you go beyond 50 parts per million water-soluble fertilizer, or 1 pound per cubic yard for controlled release fertilizer, the plants are getting bigger, but at a much less much less of a rate compared to the difference between 0 and 50 parts per million. So again, this underscores the resource use efficiency of a number of different containerized herbs. This is underscored even more when you look at basil. Look at the difference between no fertilizer and the lowest fertilizer concentrations, and you can see a big difference in growth. And as you go above 50 parts per million of water-soluble fertilizer, or 1 pound per cubic yard of controlled release fertilizer, we still see promotion, but again, it's not nearly as much as you're seeing on that low end. So, using fertilizer concentrations to suppress containerized herb growth is useful, but only to a limited degree. You can see that 50 parts per million was still sufficient fertilizer. You also see some differences when you're looking at those plants fertilized with controlled release fertilizer and those fertilized with water-soluble fertilizer. I like to use sort of an analogy of a difference between drinking a real sugary drink versus eating a handful of granola. Water-soluble fertilizer is readily available. It's going to be like that sugary drink. It's going to allow plants to grow right away, and everything is readily available, like the sugars in that drink. But with controlled release fertilizers, although we increase the concentration when we're incorporating them into our substrate, the metering out or delivery of those nutrients happens at a slower rate, and so they're not as available as the higher concentrations for water-soluble fertilizer. So by and large, I would make the stereotype that containerized herbs grown with controlled release fertilizers are generally going to be more compact than those that may be grown with water-soluble fertilizer. So that's just another thing to think about. Like I mentioned, as we restrict nutrients, we want to be very careful that we don't want to produce anything that has a nutrient deficiency. Now, when we're restricting these nutrients, plants still look good, but they might be on the edge with their nutrient deficiencies. Whether or not that deficiency shows up in the crop is going to depend how the consumer uses it. So when you think of someone who's buying that containerized basil and they're bringing it home, and they maybe want to make a caprese salad or make some bruschetta or something like that, how they harvest that plant may affect the development of nutrient deficiencies. If we just take that basil plant and harvest everything and pitch it, well, we're not going to have a problem because you're harvesting it there. But if you carefully take off the leaves and you leave some canopy and then you allow it to regrow, you may see a deficiency sprout up there when it's having that second regrowth in the consumer's home, because if the consumers are anything like me, they're probably not fertilizing their house plants. You also might see a different result if you take that container and you transplant it into the garden. There might be nutrients in that garden that might allow subsequent growth to develop without nutrient deficiencies. So it's just something to think about, sort of the ethical side of production on how we can produce a good plant but still allow our consumers to have value. Now, I'm talking here specifically, or I was just talking about overall fertilizer levels. And when we change our fertilizer concentrations with a complete fertilizer, be it water soluble or a controlled release, every nutrient is in fixed proportion in that fertilization concentration. So as we increase the concentration, everything is more, and as we reduce it, everything is less. But we can take a more targeted approach and manipulate a specific nutrient. And I am talking about phosphorus. This is a shot from Josh Henry and Brian Whipker. And they have been building on the original research from Paul Nelson at North Carolina State University that identified phosphorus as the main contributor to growth when we're looking at nutrients. Now, in this example here, you see petunias fertilized with 0 to 40 parts per million phosphorus. This is at a consistent concentration of all other nutrients, both macro, primary and secondary, and micro. So what you see here is the result of only changing the phosphorus concentration. Clearly, you can see that increasing the phosphorus increases the size of this petunia. Or said another way, clearly restricting the phosphorus is going to give you some growth control. And you can see that that plant provided with 5 parts per million phosphorus is a very attractive plant and much more compact, say, than those fertilized with 10 or 40 parts per million. So Brian Whipker and I worked together to implement this phosphorus research, again, specific to containerized culinary herbs. So we made up a nutrient solution that varied in phosphorus concentrations. Again, we had consistent concentrations of nitrogen and potassium, 150 parts per million, as well as calcium, 128 parts per million. The main variable was looking at our phosphorus concentrations. Again, we went from 0 all the way up to 40 parts per million. And 40 parts per million is about what you'd get if you were looking at using, say, a 515 fertilizer at 150 parts per million nitrogen. Now, I say all the other nutrients didn't change, but I want to stay honest with all you out there in the audience. You can see that we did have some variation between our magnesium and our sulfur. We had about a 12 part per million range with magnesium, and we had somewhere around a 5 part per million range with sulfur. While I acknowledge that variance, I am also confident that a 12 part per million range in magnesium and a 5 part per million range in sulfur did not significantly affect the results of our research. So, what did we see? This is certainly a disappointment, and it's always embarrassing. I lost the photos for this study. Let me just give you a piece of advice. If you're taking pictures of your plants and you leave your $700 digital camera sitting on the counter of your lab, visible through the window in the door to your lab, lock your lab door. We had a theft and we hadn't pulled our pictures off of the camera yet. So I am so sorry that I don't have pictures, but I promise you, it did happen. I do still have the data. They didn't want the Excel sheets. What we saw is that restricting phosphorus concentration suppressed the height of our basal. You can see that as little as 10 part per million resulted in a fairly saturated height. But when we provided less, say 5 parts per million, we got about a 30-ish% reduction in our plant height. Now, when you look at 0, you can see we had much shorter plants, but that wasn't due to diminished stem elongation. We actually saw a reduction in leaf unfolding at that extreme low phosphorus concentration. We had slightly less with the 5 part per million as compared to the 10, 20, and 40 part per million, but it was not a huge difference. We're looking at about 8 compared to about 8.5 leaves. Now, while reducing that phosphorus does produce a more compact plant, yes, it is going to reduce mass, both fresh and dry mass. But think about what I said earlier in this presentation. We're talking about containerized herbs. When you take a 4-inch pot of basil and you bring it to checkout, you're not setting it on a scale to measure its unit weight. When you look at the tag, it's going to say a 1-quart container. It's not going to say 3/4 of an ounce like you might see with a fresh cut culinary herbs. Containerized basil is not, or containerized herbs are not sold by unit weight. So although we do have diminished fresh mass and dry mass with those more compact plants, it's not going to reduce the revenue because your sales are not based on weight. I would not recommend lowering your phosphorus concentrations when you're producing culinary herbs for cut, because that could suppress your yields because we are looking at weight. We did see, like we've seen with, like we saw with the restricted irrigation, when you grow drier, you do get smaller leaves, and we also got less branching. What was interesting is at those lower phosphorus concentrations, we saw a spike in EC, and we primarily attribute that to diminished uptake. We also saw a slightly diminished pH. Now, what I want to look at here is looking at the basal tissue phosphorus, because we want to think about what we're sending our customers. Again, the phosphorus concentration in the basal increased as we increased phosphorus. That would make a lot of sense. But what about the basal symptomology? Well, if we look at the recommended tissue concentrations, published recommendations for basal, you can see that only those plants provided with 40 parts per million phosphorus met that desired tissue concentration of 0.6 to 1% of phosphorus in leaf tissue. However, those that were provided with no phosphorus had deficiency symptoms, insufficient phosphorus. We had purpling, and because it had advanced, we also had chlorosis. Now, what I'd like to note is that as you're looking at 5, 10, and 20 parts per million, we have less than sufficient phosphorus, but we had no deficient phosphorus symptomology. So again, is this going to result in phosphorus deficiency symptoms later on? Well, it depends. Are they harvesting it all and eating it today? Are they cutting it and regrowing it on its windowsill? Or are they planting it out into a garden? Things to consider when we're manipulating treatments. So again, phosphorus restriction worked for all the species. Generally speaking, those plants provided with 5 to 20 parts per million or milligrams per liter phosphorus had no phosphorus deficiency symptoms, even it was suboptimal tissue concentrations. So again, restricting phosphorus is going to be a useful tool for containerized herbs. Now, one of the last things I'd like to mention is brushing our plants using thigmotactic control. Now, here we see some tomato plants out at a greenhouse just west of here. And what they're doing is they've attached some old plastic sheeting to their booms, and they drag their booms across their plants multiple times a day to brush them. And brushing is a way to restrict the elongation of stems. And this goes back to early work done by Carrie Mitchell and Joyce Latimer when she was Dr. Mitchell's graduate student at Purdue University. Again, it's been shown to work on vegetable transplants, but what about herbs? Well, we took some basil, parsley, oregano, and sage, transplanted them, and then we had 3 different treatments. Plants were not brushed. We had a brushing session once a day, and that was in the morning, or we had a brushing session twice per day, in the morning as well as in the afternoon. Now, when we look at basil, we saw no difference in plant size based on the brushing regime. No difference at all. We saw the same height across treatments, but there are differences across species. When we look at parsley, you can see that having 2 brushing sessions a day absolutely produced a more compact plant compared to those unbrushed plants. And even 1 brushing session per day still suppressed stem elongation. So this was not a very in-depth study, so clearly more research needs to be conducted. When you look at the literature on brushing, of which there is a lot of when we go to Denmark, because they have so few growth regulators that are labeled, you need to look at the number of brushes, the brushing speed, the weight of the brushing material. It's actually pretty interesting research and variables to look at. Again, as with restricting irrigation, if brushing doesn't control the basal height, how widespread is it going to be used? Because a culinary herb grower will grow multiple species, but the most of what they're growing will be growing because basil is king. So what does this all mean? Basil, there is no silver bullet for non-chemical growth control for culinary herbs. We have to use an integrated and additive approach. There's no single non-chemical technique. So we should integrate multiple different approaches to achieve growth control. You've heard that phrase, everything in moderation. I would modify it to say every technique with some in moderation. Because again, we can use cultivar selection, diff, controlling moisture, fertilizer, phosphorus is brushing to control our herb growth. Now, we're almost out of time, but I just want to quick come back to, do PGRs have a future for containerized culinary herbs? Because we already see them developed for some food crops. Again, the solanaceous plants, 10 parts per million of uniconazole before the true leaf stage. Well, I've been working on this too for quite a while, and I can tell you that it's not a problem of PGRs not working. Here we see some 288 cell basil and 128 cell basil treated with a GA inhibiting plant growth retardant. And it absolutely works. There's no doubt about the physiology that the PGR works. But where the problem comes in is the residue on the foliage. Now, I mentioned we have PGRs for tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. What do they all have in common, aside from being the solanaceous plant family? They're fruiting vegetable crops. So when we're treating them in the greenhouse, they still have quite a while until they produce fruits that are going to be harvested. But think about that 4-inch pot of basil. it might have gotten sprayed a week ago with a PGR, or maybe just before they go out the door to hold them during the retail phase. They go into their retail space, the consumer buys it. When you're looking at leafy crops like herbs, they may be consumed right away. And so the pre-harvest interval from applying that PGR until the point of consumption is virtually going to render chemical plant growth retardants unusable on leafy crops or non-fruiting crops. I don't say that to be pessimistic or be a downer. It's just a sober reality, and one that I've run up against as we're working on developing a new label for plant growth retardants for food crops. Herbs are not a part of that label because of the pre-harvest interval. This work was supported by a variety of different companies and institutions, and so I'd like to thank Farm Tech, Johnny's, Peters, Oasis, IDALS, and the Glockner Foundation for their support. But more importantly, I get to sit here and talk to you about all this work, but it's all the people up here, former graduate students and undergraduate students. They're the ones who are in here on the nights and weekends. They're the ones who deserve all the credit. I'll just take all the blame for any flaws in the presentation or the design of the experiments. They put in their sweat equity for this work. So with that, I thank you very much for your time today. If I could just stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate